sociology at Harvard University. And will be chatting with us about some of her work. So this should be really interesting. And Brianna, take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here with you today. It's really great to finally get to talk to a group of adaptation professionals who are thinking about migration questions. So I am a PhD candidate at Harvard University. I'm in the sociology department, and I study migration and also adaptation to climate change. So a little bit of when and how people decide to move due to climate hazards, but also how they adapt and manage to stay in place, because people often don't move, as we'll talk about today. So today I'm going to talk a bit about crisis migration and chronic mobility, both of which are a part of the climate migration response. We're going to dispel a few myths and talk about just the backdrop of studying migration and climate change together. And also, I'm going to turn our attention to non-migration for a bit of my presentation based on my research. To really understand migration, we have to understand non-migration as well. And the data that I'll talk about today mainly comes from Colombia, and then I will try to tie it back to the US context for the group. If you have questions along the way, just stop me. Okay, so I want to make sure that are you seeing my slides change? There we go. So you should be seeing a slide now. Okay, great. So we'll start off with the kind of narrative that we all see in the media and policy context related to climate change migration. We often see images like this of waves of migrants walking through the desert. Migration scholars aren't very surprised by images like this, although we do look and very rarely find data to support waves of climate migrants like this. Another popular image that circulated in the media you may have seen are like this of boats coming across the Mediterranean Sea from Africa full of migrants. And these kinds of photos really stick in people's minds. And they contribute to trends like securitization of borders, funding for closing borders, building walls, and this idea of keeping people in place as a response to and fear of groups of migrants coming across the border. The thing is, this isn't the real story or what we actually see when we study climate change, or that I've seen in my work so far. More recently, this paper came out a few days ago in the UK. Will places become uninhabitable and waves of migrants be forced to come to the Northern Hemisphere? And this is just really dangerous and not quite supported by the way climate migration is occurring now. And I just think it can do more harm than good. So I want to kind of speak to these narratives today with research. What we actually see is more similar to what was predicted in the groundswell report that came out by the World Bank. We like to circulate numbers of how many millions of climate migrants we might see in the coming decades, anywhere from 80 million to 200 million. This number comes from the World Bank, 143 million. And this is closer to what would be reflected by research on the ground, which is migrants that are internal. These 143 million are internal migrants. They stay within their own country in 3 regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America primarily. And this is based on predictive modeling that the World Bank did. So given these narratives, what will climate migration actually look like? What can we expect and what do we see on the ground? I can present to you a little bit of kind of environmental migration scholarly research and the overarching findings from that. We see that most environmental migrations are internal, so within your own country. They're temporary, so displacement more than permanent moves, and they happen over short distances. So we're talking about a few miles or one village over to the next, not cross-border migrations or long-distance migrations across the country. They also occur within a web of other stressors. So they're in a political context, a historical context, an economic context, a family decision-making context, all of which impacts a move of which like a climate hazard occurs on top of. We see that families with more resources, it doesn't mean you're in the 1%, but more resources and more savings available tend to be more mobile and travel further. Those families are more strategic in the moves that they make in the face of a climate hazard. And environmental migration patterns are you see more environmental and climate migration in areas that have established migrant routes. So for example, the Central American context, where there's a long history of families migrating from Central America to the United States for a variety of reasons, those places are more likely to send international climate migrants because they have the social networks and the history in place and the knowledge in place to follow those same migrant routes. And overwhelmingly, the majority of people don't migrate. most people want to stay where they are. And so when you do see migration, it's important to consider how dire must the situation be that people have chosen to move. And it's interesting, even the biggest disasters that we've studied in the US, for example, the Dust Bowl or Hurricane Katrina, those areas repopulated. You know, a decade after Hurricane Katrina, there are as many, if not more, residents living in New Orleans than there were before the storm. So it might not be the same residents, but places do tend to repopulate. This is a framework from Black et al. Looking at the drivers of migration, so environmental migration. This is, you know, a complicated graphic to look at. It's not the most beautifully designed, but it is the most cited and most commonly used. And I put this up here to show you just how complicated a decision to migrate, which is on the right side, is, and all the social, political, individual, economic, household factors go into that decision to stay or go. So the climate stressor comes into this very complicated context in which people are making decisions about their lives. So you don't need to remember this diagram, but noting how complicated it is great.
Okay.
So climate migration.
Your neighbors, Chris and Ellen.
Uh-oh, somebody might need to mute. Climate migration scholars and scientists have begun to publicly call for interrogating these media narratives of waves of migrants and waves of climate migrants and refugees. This comment came out December 2019, I believe, in Nature Climate Change. And there's a large group of really prominent scholars of migration from Europe, the US, Australia, who came together to say that there's no empirical evidence for these waves. And yes, people move, but not in the way that is being touted in the media. And discussing it that way kind of prevents us from being able to really think about the needs of communities and the kinds of moves that are happening if they're not waves of cross-border migrants. So if people aren't, for the large part, moving, what does that mean for resilience and adaptation planning? And what does it mean for how we prepare and think about migrants in our work? And there are a number of reasons I've found that people stay. So I'm going to talk about that today, and I'm going to talk about how people stay in place through coping and resilience strategies. Really wealthy people can afford to stay. People don't want to leave. They are attached for a number of reasons: historical, cultural, ancestry, identity to the places where they live. And my research that I'm going to talk about now was launched in Colombia, in rural Colombia in South America in 2016. And I studied these families for 3 years during protracted drought that began with it was a severe 3-year drought. And then I continued working with families during the recovery process and as climate patterns were clearly permanently shifted after the drought. So the first piece I'll talk about is the crisis migration from my empirical data. So how people responded during the end of a 3-year drought. They didn't know it was ending, but 3 years, no rain, no water in a subsistence agriculture region, and who moved and who didn't and why. So this is my area of study. This is Colombia, and there's this dark gray department is the Bolivar department. The entire southern part of that is Carmen de Bolivar. I use ethnographic methods and interview data that I collected over 3 years in the subsistence agriculture region. Though there's a lot written on agricultural workers and how they depend on the climate and are resilient to crisis, there isn't as much known about how they perceive and respond to climate change as a permanent shift. So we'll talk about that today. So here's just some coverage of the drought. The severe drought began in 2012, and by February of 2016, there had been no rain in all of that time. And that's when I began collecting data in response to reports like this of farmers displacing or migrating due to the drought. So as an overarching just kind of framework to think about, what I found is that we often talk about and think about migration as a binary decision, a one-time moment where you decide to either stay or go. And we're asking ourselves, when do people decide to stay or go when they're faced with climate change hazards or a disaster? But I argue that migration is a little bit more sequential than that people decide to stay or go many, many times in a series. And each time that you decide to stay, it becomes less likely and more difficult to decide to migrate later, because you invest things, you invest resources, you make mental decisions, you spend money to adapt, you sell things off, you make sacrifices in place that make it a further climb out of your current context to migrate. And whether people make an early decision to migrate in that decision-making series that in an adaptive way, or a late decision to migrate is fundamentally different in the kind of migrant that we see. So if it's an early one, it's more adaptive and strategic. And if it's further down the line in a climate hazard situation, you see people migrate in situations of distress. And I'm going to just keep that framework in mind as I'm talking about this case. So these two primary types of migrants that I want to refer to in this case were the adaptive at the beginning and the distress migrants in the end of the drought. Both kinds were resisting permanent migration. Even the adaptive migrants, who were those with slightly more resources, maybe they had somewhere to stay in an urban center, maybe they had family that would take them in, maybe they had someone that would watch their land while they left. Even those people intended for the migration to be temporary and planned to return after the drought. Distressed migrants said they weren't going to migrate no matter what, and they only migrated if they completely ran out of resources, ran out of water, and it was just completely infeasible to continue coping in place. So when their resilience mechanisms and coping strategies ran out, that's when they would move, and they would move without savings and without a plan. The longer the crisis drug on, the harder it became to stay and the more costly it became to stay. And so thinking about that in a policy context is important, and the fact that throughout a crisis, you will see there are different kinds of climate migrants who move for different reasons. Here are some strategies that people use to avoid migrating: limiting consumption, limiting meals, pulling kids out of school, liquidating assets, so selling off livestock, selling off pieces of land, selling off any possessions that people had. Community action: people would work together to, for example, go digging, looking for water, looking to see if they could dig deep enough to make a new well, lobbying local officials for support, activating social ties to move to an urban center, to have someone to stay with, for someone to remit income to you while you try to wait it out. And then what I call targeted migration, which is sending someone out of the household who is either a financial burden, for example, an elderly resident in the home. You might ask family elsewhere to take them in because it was infeasible to continue supporting them during this time. Or you might, if you had a young person in your home, 18, 19, 17, who could work in an urban center and remit some income back to you to keep you in place, then that was a strategy used as well. And this is what a distress migration outcome looked like. So while an adaptive migration might mean you moved to a home to live with family or you had a plan in place, a distress migration meant you took apart whatever you had and you ended up in a shanty like this at the edge of another village or at the edge of an urban center outside of the drought in really desperate circumstances. So, and this is why I say the kind of migrant, temporary, permanent matters. And all this is in the context of the fact that even given the harsh conditions and even given these two kinds of migration, anyone that could stay in place and their coping strategies lasted to the end of the drought stayed. And it was over 50% of people who stayed throughout the entire thing using those coping strategies, which means at the end of the drought, savings were depleted, harvests were lost, animals were dead. They were in a much more vulnerable position than they had been before this drought. And so as the climate continues to shift, crises become more frequent. These people are in a more vulnerable position to be mindful of. And then continuing my work over time, after a crisis situation, I saw more chronic mobility. And mobility, I mean by that, people living in multiple places at the same time. For example, traveling to work, but maybe living a little further away because they didn't see the place that they had previously lived as sustainable any longer. Farmers began to tell me, it's clear that things aren't going to go back to normal. Rainfall isn't going to be like it was. It's hotter than it ever was. The ground doesn't grow crops the way that it did after the severe heat. When the rain comes, it comes heavier and faster and washes my seeds out of the ground. So we have to be more mobile in order to continue our livelihoods in this place. And there were a number of shifts that people made to facilitate that mobility, but continuing to maintain their livelihoods as farmers. And crisis is just a permanent aspect of life in this region, environmental hazards and crisis. This article is from mid-November, I want to say, and this was just a severe flooding period because now they've had severe rainfall events with the hurricanes that came through the Northern Caribbean and the Caribbean in November. So a place that had no water, complete drought, now is inundated with floods. And so people are having to be even more responsive than ever before to changing environmental conditions. So a few things that people have done, mobility is particularly important here because this is a map of the region. You can see these low mountains that stretch up and down through the area, is that microclimates make a big difference, right? So you can move 2 miles and have a different growing condition. Maybe you get a little more rainfall than you did on the land that you were on before, or you can live where you live and then begin to travel to someone else's land to work very close by, but see different harvests and different conditions. So that mobility is a big change. Other things that people have done to remain in place instead of moving as the climate becomes less productive for their livelihood is major transition from cows to pigs. So previously, at the time of the drought and immediately after, everyone was raising cattle. And now most of the cattle died out. And even if it's replaced by government programs, for example, people prefer pigs because they require less water, less space, less grazing. And it's a faster birth to cash out for them. Pigs grow and can be sent, to become meat much faster than cows. And with less predictable seasons, that's a valuable shift. Also, farmers have small animals like lambs that you would never have seen before. People have dug more of these, they're called highways in this area, but just reservoirs to capture water. So they're more prepared than they had been in the past to get by a little bit longer during longer dry periods. Not a drought like happened in 2013 to 16, but the kind of dry season they're seeing now, and also shifting the kinds of crops that they grow to those that have quicker returns. Also, there's been a move away from tubers like yucca because some things need too much rain, more than they can get, and other things rot in the ground too easily with a strong rain season. So, for example, this is a field of plantain, which is something that many farmers are trying, or fruit vines, in exchange for field crops. And then one thing that happened during this drought was women began migrating temporarily into urban centers. We often see men migrating in this world of migration studies, but women began working in urban centers because they were able to clean houses or had more marketable skills than the men did, who had always worked in agriculture. And so some of them have continued to stay in the urban center and then travel back on the weekends. They do things like make sugarcane syrup or small fried foods on the side as businesses that they can maintain to supplement the farming income as it's going down with shifting environmental conditions. And then lastly, people have begun to build homes that are easier to kind of take apart and put back together, and they move them around on their farmland based on wind conditions, heat conditions, rain, and where things are growing. So you can see this plastic tarp on the top and a mud-based house can be reconstructed quickly. Houses like this, I didn't see them before the drought, and now they've become more common with the explicit purpose of kind of a more mobile material. So now I'm conducting research in other sites, and my hunch is that increased mobility and livelihood flexibility holds in many contexts. For example, you can imagine people moving up the bayou in Louisiana, but still traveling down during shrimp season, or living on a barrier island, but staying inland during the off season, or maybe you're a snowbird. I mean, that's another way to be mobile and avoid really harsh weather conditions. And I think that kind of more open-minded approach to what moves and responses to climate hazards may look like might do us a little more good in our planning and policy response. My respondents, especially in Colombia now, don't talk about where they live in the same way that they did before. It's not so much a binary. They kind of live in multiple places at once in a way that enables them to continue their livelihoods and farming as the climate shifts. So, I want to make this relevant to you all in your work. Like, what climate migration should we be preparing for in the US? What should we be thinking about as adaptation professionals? How can you make this knowledge of what's happening in the migration scholarship world useful to your work? And I've told you many ways that people avoid, and often extreme ways that people avoid migrating. And I've explained how people who do migrate in this very unmanaged way are often in distress. So now I'm going to share some info on migration in the US in recent years that may or may not be familiar to you. So, contrary to what you might see in the media or hear on the political stage, migration patterns, for example, measured since 2015, primarily reflect 3 major trends. One, the immigration to the United States of foreign-born people, so someone born in another country immigrating to the US, has declined. There's an increase in foreign-born people moving out of the United States, so an increase in emigration with an E. And then there have been changes in Puerto Rican migration after Hurricane Maria in 2017. So our net migration, when you put together the number of people leaving the US who are foreign born compared to the number of people entering the US who are foreign born, we're in the net negative and have been since 2010, really. And it's even after Hurricane Maria, that reversed in 2018 and 19. So now more people are moving back to or Puerto Rico than are moving to the US from right after the hurricane. If you look at immigration to the US by country of residence, now China has replaced Mexico as the largest sending country of foreign-born immigrants to the United States as of 2018. At the beginning of the decade, Mexico was still the largest, but immigration from Mexico has significantly dropped since the recession in 2008. And also border apprehensions are the lowest that they've been since, they dropped in 2010, but since 2000, we're at record lows. So Border Patrol with not as much to do at the border has relied on ICE arresting people in the United States without documentation in the interior of the country, further from the borders themselves. People claiming asylum from Central America often are not now trying to enter as often without inspection because the asylum process has been brought to a halt by the Trump administration. So many people are just on the other side of the border hoping that their asylum cases will be heard who are moving from Central America. And the construction of the border wall continues as people who have been settled in the US are being detained and deported. So even giving all of this, the fact that our net migration is going down, border apprehensions are down, asylum cases are not being processed, I do think we'll see a huge surge in cross-border migration, whether authorized or unauthorized, right after Biden enters office. I think this will be really complicated, but I think it'll be for a few reasons. Think back to that really messy model by Black of how complicated these decisions are. But many Central American countries were really affected by the recent hurricanes in November, specifically Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And there's a backlog in asylum cases being processed too. So in the coming year in the adaptation community, I think we should be looking towards and thinking about victims of hurricanes Eta and Iota coming across the border. It's an established migrant route that people have used for a long time. Many Central Americans who reside in the US send remittances back to family in Central America. So with the COVID-19 crisis and the economic hardship here on this side of the border, that's affecting families in Central America as well, especially as they try to manage devastation from these hurricanes. Recovery will be slow. Those economies are also affected by COVID-19, and the governments just don't have much capacity for disaster recovery, especially one hurricane on the heels of another. Crops are severely damaged, buildings are damaged, the economy is damaged. And the kind of aid that USAID has given in the past to situations like this has been different under the Trump administration as well. In fact, Central American leaders asked the United Nations to declare Central America the region most affected by climate change not long ago due to severe hurricane impacts and rainfall increases. So this is all something to think about on this side of the border and to prepare for. And then what about internal migration in the United States? Because we're not unaffected by this, as you all know really well. And I would guess that we will similarly see increased mobility, less long distance migration, but this near short distance movement in climate stress zones. And I think it's already happening in fishing communities with snowbirds. And that's not what we often think about, but it is a part of climate mobility. And in my opinion, thus far, this kind of movement in livelihood communities where their livelihoods depend on natural resources has been kind of uncoordinated. You also see in coastal areas as insurance premiums go up and up and up, people move further inland and commute further for their work on the coast. And even given that, the public narrative is still one of anticipating internal migration. So here's one example of that. After Hurricane Dorian in North Carolina, this article came out in the Washington Post asking if residents would retreat. And I'm currently doing fieldwork in coastal North Carolina on these same topics. And, you know, this article keeps coming up and people keep saying, what a horrible article. We don't know how someone wrote that. And right now there are hazard mitigation specialists on Ocracoke helping families with their FEMA grant applications for elevations. Not doing buyouts. So, you know, there are over 200 elevation application permits that occurred on Ocracoke. no buyouts, and it's a very small island, so that's a significant amount. So local press compared to national press, what kind of responses we're seeing where people, again, here are adapting in place or making changes to their homes and structures in place rather than moving. So maybe we need to broaden what we think of as climate migration, mobility, and adaptation in all of our work. So that's mainly what I wanted to talk about today. I hope it gives you lots of fodder for questions. I realize that migration and retreat conversations in the US are mostly about flooding and sea level rise. And I'm studying that as well here in North Carolina. So I'd just like to reiterate that the kind of extreme strategies that I see for adapting to living with water or without it remind us that moving isn't the first thing that people do. It's not the first response that they have to climate hazards. In fact, it's a rather late response, especially to flood risk in particular. And so many things happen before that that come at different costs, especially to different families with different resources. So when we're talking about flood risk impacts and policies, I think keeping that in mind will really help us in our adaptation work. Yeah. So I don't know if there are questions.
Sure, I have a question. Brianna, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Jim Hyde. And by the way, it's just a coincidence that I'm wearing my Cartagena hat. I had
I love it.
Cartagena is in the province you
Yeah.
studied. Yeah, fantastic work. I mean, truly amazing. As someone who's written about these topics for a while, you've really educated me. What do you think, what you learned in Colombia, what does that say about the importance of providing more assistance for people to adapt in place?
I think that that's very important. And I think that that's more often the request of families and communities, especially in the work that I do and others that I know do, is assistance adapting in place. And I think that oftentimes we make assumptions about what that assistance should be and what kind of needs there are to adapt in place, but sometimes those assumptions aren't quite as aligned with what's happening on the ground as they could be. So I think good evidence of what people are doing that's working would really help us provide meaningful assistance to communities. So one example is that the Colombian government, with all the best intentions, is still providing cows. And everyone will tell you, I cannot support cows any longer in this climate, but now they're getting these cows they have to maintain to be in compliance with assistance. They don't have the water to maintain them. So, I mean, that's a very obvious misalignment, but I think that happens to varying degrees even here. Yeah. And I love your hat, by the way.
Me too. Well, no one else is jumping in yet, so I'll ask you another question, which is, have you had occasion to study the usefulness of weather risk index insurance for people who are exposed to droughts and floods in the developing world?
I have not studied that specifically, and in this region of Colombia, people don't have insurance. I think that would be very helpful. One thing that I can say related to finance and agriculture and drought is that families often take out loans to be able to plant the next harvest if they lose their seeds. So if you have one bad harvest due to a climate stressor and you lose your seeds, then you need a loan from an agricultural bank to plant the next harvest. You guarantee that loan with your cows as collateral or your harvest from the year before often as collateral, or to demonstrate to the bank that you will pay them back. So if you've lost that the year before, or if your livestock died, then you're not able to secure a loan the next year. And if you don't pay one back, then you definitely can't get one later on. So yeah, I think insurance would be a much better way to support these farmers, but it's not happening in the area where I work yet.
I'll post a link in the chat to a paper on that topic. Thank you.
Great. I see a couple.
Mark,
Hi.
And great presentation. I want to just give a brief observation about a domestic climate change refugee issue, which is the Camp Fire in California, the destruction of the city of Paradise and Magali, a couple of other towns. I'm a Muni Bond person. The city of Chico is a client. Chico's population in 48 hours went from 90,000 to 115,000. And some of the dislocations disruptions ended up on national media. The learning here is that even in the very wealthy part of the world, in the wealthy state, the evacuation protocols are all short term. It's for, everything is built around people needing to get out for like 24 hours or something, and then, have a place to stay for a couple of days and then go back home. This case, we actually had real climate change refugees because their town was gone, and it's still not there. And it may not be there for a while. And that's a whole, on the stay on the managed retreat issue. So one of the learning things for, I'll call it climate change refugees, at least in the United States, is that our system is built around short-term evacuations. It is not designed to handle long-term evacuations. The greater Sacramento Valley, Butte County, Chico were really on their own. There's no federal help of any kind. The state, for good reasons, and local government was clueless. And I don't mean that pejoratively, because people realize, oh my God, what do we do with 30,000 people that have no home, are not going to have a home anytime soon? And what do we do? And I'll end my comment with that the sense that collectively, at least in this country, we need to start to figure that one out too, because we are going to have climate change related disasters where there is no home to go back to. And our whole system, as we saw from Paradise, failed because we really haven't thought through long-term evacuation needs. So thank you. I'll be quiet now.
I really appreciate your point. And fires are one area where I have no expertise, and I'll be the first to admit it. The idea that entire communities can be gone, overnight is a very different scenario than the more gradual climate impacts that we often study, and gradual increase of flood levels, drought that progresses slowly. And I think we all remember images of the FEMA trailers in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And it's just another example. And this shows that we haven't figured it out yet, right? Like, what does a long-term evacuation look like? And sure, the international models, we can look at refugee camps, but I definitely don't think that's what we want to look at or replicate in the US context.
Well,
so I think
the Walmart in Chico became a refugee camp, literally from us, the parking lot of Walmart. That was the American idea of a refugee camp. So how appropriate.
Yeah, I do.
So
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really good segue to what I wanted to bring out. It's a little bit of shift in the conversation. My PhD research was on forced displacement and aesthetics, particularly how the trauma of the forced displacement has an opportunity to work its way through in first, second generation or third generation displaced persons, depending on the availability of different aesthetic forces. And so one of the people that I was looking at, of course, is the Japanese architect Shigeru Ban, who really put a lot of emphasis on the aesthetic beauty of these refugee habitats, because it really makes a difference. So I guess my question to you is, in all the work that you've done, have you brought this question about aesthetics and or the trauma of displacement into your conversations with your subjects or in your analysis?
Your work sounds really fascinating, and thank you for that question. Aesthetics is hugely important. My subjects, the families that I've worked with, and I spend a lot of time with people. I don't just visit for 30 minutes and go, which is, the luxury of the kind of research that I do. Aesthetics do come up, and they talk about the way that the landscape looks, the way that they design their homes, the way that, and it's emblematic of identity too, in many cases. I haven't made any kind of recommendations for aesthetics beyond, I have had the opportunity to give some talks at the design school, for example, at Harvard, and talk about how can we think about structures in these climate stressed regions that both aesthetically match what families prefer and are used to, but also might facilitate the kind of mobility that is necessary right now.
Yes, I'd love to continue the conversation with you.
That would be
So
great.
we should figure that out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Brianna, I had a question in terms of when someone might ask you, migration is natural, it's historic, it's always happened. What's different? Why the attention now? How do you approach answering that?
And when you say someone might ask me, what kind of person do you mean?
I guess from a more general audience, one that is not necessarily convinced that climate is a driver, for example, because we see that sometimes. So what's different about, say, climate driven? Is there a different answer you think you might give now than you would have a dozen years ago? Definitely.
I do get this question from general audiences. And I think what's different now is that the strategies that have worked for the past 20 or 30 years are not working now. And so strategies that people could rely on to get through a drought or to deal with a flood, the bar is being pushed forward. And when those strategies don't work, we're having to find new strategies, which sometimes we can do and sometimes we can't. And also, I think the development pressure is different now than it has been in the past. So we've developed in different ways. We've hardened certain forms of infrastructure in ways that they weren't before. And so the confluence of development, the way our economy looks now, and the greater severity of the climate impacts makes a big difference. Also, the frequency is so much higher that people don't have time. Recovery is kind of illusory anyway. We know that recovery is a bit of a myth. You recover, but you don't recover to things being the way they were exactly before a disaster took place, for example. So as these things happen closer together, there's less time for recovery.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer.
Thanks, Dave.
Hi, Brianna. This is Christian. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi, Christian.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
I like your background.
Thanks. I was really interested and glad you highlighted the point about like the sequential decision making that sometimes happens with migrants and whether they choose to stay multiple times before whatever factors lead them to leave. I was wondering if you have seen or looked at examples in your research or in other work or even in conversations with folks, if there have been like specific policies that account for that sequential nature. And the way I'm thinking about it is because I've had a conversation with folks. I'm based here in Miami, and there's not a significant buyout program here right now, but I think some conversations have been had about, could there be a program where, this is talking about sea level rise and flooding more specifically, but could we sign people up in places where we know they're going to be at higher and higher risk in the next 10, 20, 30 years? If they are planning to stay long term, can we set them up in some sort of 10-year program where if they experience flooding from some, whether it's a king tide or a hurricane, over 10 years, at the end of that program, there's the agreement that they will leave and they have sort of a choice, maybe more power in the decision. The details of that, obviously, no one's really fleshed out, but I'm just curious if anything like that has come up in your work.
So thank you for your question. And yes, Miami is definitely a place where thinking about how these decisions are made is critical. So this idea of sequential migration decisions is new. It'll come out in a journal somewhere from me soon. But so I haven't seen it, considered in that way yet in programs, but I do think that it would be very helpful. And what I would really like to be able to do, let me backtrack. For example, if you're trying to offer a voluntary buyout to a family, some moments along that series of decisions will be better than other moments if for the family and for you to likely get a response of accepting the buyout on your end as a practitioner. So for example, if a family has had one flood where they maybe had a claim, but it wasn't severely damaging, and then another time their property was completely destroyed and they rebuilt it, and then you come in and offer a buyout, like, you're not very likely to get an acceptance. So I think two things are important. You know, you figure out where a family is in the sequence of decisions, how many disasters, how many investments have been made in the place. And then you also think about when the last storm was, right? So there's a moment after a storm or after a flood where people are pulling everything out of their houses onto the sidewalks and waiting for, like, that might be the moment to come in and talk about buyouts if they happen in a faster way than they do now. I'm not sure. But I would really like to do some research on the factors that go into accepting or not a buyout and the long-term consequences, or accepting or not when the funds come through states. Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that, is that the FEMA, I'll call it managed retreat program, the funding takes years as a rule of thumb. I don't really understand why. And Brianna, what you put on the table, I think, is one of the core problems we have. Even when there is funding, it's not like you've got people at the evacuation center walking down the sidewalk ready to write checks. That's just not how the system works right now. And you're right, that's the best way it would work. But 5 years later, FEMA shows up with a check, and it's all history. They've forgotten it.
Right. People on Ocracoke. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that I would really agree with what you're saying about timing. We deal with people and are working with people who, for example, the furniture in their house is destroyed. The value of buying back that furniture is more than they're offered by their insurance. So they end up paying a lot of money out of pocket. Then the value of their house drops, and so they have a lot of equity in the house. And then when the buyout comes in, it's going to be 75% of the reduced value of the house, and people can't really contemplate losing their savings like that, when it's not just losing the value of the mortgage, but also their life savings that's gone into the house. So yeah, I would completely agree that timing is part of it, but also just the value of the buyout. Even if logically it's going to make sense for the person to take it because it's not going to get better, it's only going to get worse. Which I appreciate what you're saying about timing. We absolutely see that the people moving earlier being better off, but just the facing, like, losing your savings in the house, which is where most people have it, is too difficult decision for a lot of people to make. But
definitely, I think we're very late if that's the moment when we approach family for a buyout often. Some of the work that I'm doing is in inland North Carolina with farming communities dealing with saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. And there's a joke in this area that people tell me over and over. They call it the 45-day memory. And they're like, oh yeah, we remember, like, we say that maybe we'd move and everything is so horrible and storms are so horrible for about 45 days after the storm. And then we forget. And I'll be sitting with folks and there's a foot of water in the yard, no storm. This is just, a high tide, and asking about, flooding and how it impacts their lives. And they'll say they don't, it never really floods, so it's all perspective and what people are used to.
Yeah.
And what they know how to manage. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, we see people
who, the way we think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, who do want to move and would move, but they're just like, well, it depends on what the offer is, basically, and people who are also facing repeat flooding. I had a quick follow-on question for you, or not really follow-on, but just question relating to what you were saying about New Orleans and people moving back in after Katrina. I know there are a lot of areas there that haven't even recovered, and people are still there because they haven't been able to leave. For the people who are moving in, you mentioned they might be different people. Is that sort of in a different income group and different neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods that haven't been repaired? And is that something that you see in more places than just Katrina areas?
The most work and the most empirical work in the US that we have is still from Katrina. So we do know more about that case than other cases. New Orleans became whiter and wealthier 10 years later after the storm. So, I mean, it is different people for sure. And property values are extraordinarily high in New Orleans now. But same thing, with the Dust Bowl, it depopulated during the Dust Bowl. And, 100 years later, the population is higher than it ever was before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So abandoning the area isn't what we've seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yet,
Right. Yeah.
And I know there are a lot of questions in the chat. I'm not very good at managing the chat and the video at the same time. So, yeah.
So hi, can anyone hear me? Just to let you guys know, if we can maybe take just a couple questions out of the chat. We're coming on about 10 minutes to the hour. So just maybe 1 or 2 questions. Whichever ones you think are most, you want to answer the most.
You want me to pick them from the chat?
Yeah, if you'd like, yeah.
Okay. There's a lot in here. Thank you guys so much for engaging with this talk. I think we touched on how buyout programs interface with migration decisions, so I'm not going to hit that one. Someone did ask how much the migration is caused by internal conflict in Colombia, and that's, you know, a little bit more specific, but I'll say none of it in this case. In fact, all of these folks had migrated during the conflict and had returned in 2010 and 11 and resettled in the area. So this wasn't an area of active conflict at the time at all. And if anything, that made, you know, people more rooted because they had kind of returned and rebuilt their lives recently. And someone else asked about migration being less likely if alternative employment is available and accessible. I think the answer to that is yes. I think that if there are alternative livelihoods that are accessible to people and people can afford to maintain the cost of a home in this place. So for example, in the United States, if insurance premiums on your home go up so much that even with an alternative livelihood, you can't afford to live there, then that's a problem. But yes, I do think that would help with people having to migrate. And the caveat to that is, like, if you're in a place with infrastructure for water, you know, and infrastructure for electricity. So if the infrastructure is maintained, that, you know, if it's not raining, you need water, for example. Any other questions people want to ask in the last few minutes? And this is great. If there are comments too, I'd love to hear them, or things you think I should take a look at.
Just can't emphasize enough here the concerns that's been addressed, and it's even starker thanks to the pandemic fallout, the socioeconomic fallout from pandemic, but socioeconomic equity. And a post, there are pieces, so point everyone to this national nonprofit Strong Towns. They've specifically been focusing a lot on building resiliency, starting with fiscal viability, which actually has a much better chance of cutting across political divides. So you can actually take climate action without even having to say the words climate change, honestly. So, and one example they highlight was their case study, since the exec director has been very familiar with them. He's worked with that city pretty closely on these matters, Lafayette, Louisiana, and actually highlighted that really the most productive areas of many places across states are actually the poorest areas if you go by land use. So you're actually having a situation where, and probably the same thing with New Orleans, chances were that probably you had places like the lower Ninth Ward in that area subsidizing the more affluent parts, despite that part being the most heavily affected. And yet, why are we targeting the poor areas for buyout? If that's the case, should we not instead be focusing on what's financially most productive land use, focus on those? And then if there are areas that are quite marginal, so for example, I think going back to the example of Florida, if you're restoring the Everglades, shouldn't we get rid of at least the marginal land use? So, and I'd say especially what came to mind this morning, thinking about this further, was, well, some land uses probably even have negative value. Think monocrop agriculture. So if those could actually be rewilded, say in Florida, for example, that may even be a positive benefit on all fronts there.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. We only have a couple of minutes, but Brianna, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation and for giving us a lot of great perspectives to kind of, you know, fill in some of the spaces, you know, that that sometimes we might pass over something because we assume we know it or such. But I really appreciate your time.